this video, we are going to create a recipe search app with Nextjs using Typesense. Let's get started.
You can see that Delicious Recipes app is working just great. We can always search here for curry. And if we also make a mistake and just do curry, it's also going to work. Assuming you have already installed Nextjs, let's install some dependencies. We are going to install Typesense and a Typesense instant search adapter, as well as Tailwind, CSS forms, and some hero icons for React. We are going to use Typesense locally, so that means I'm going to create a Docker Compose file. And I'm going to keep the implementation very simple. So we're going to use Typesense, and we're also going to have Typesense data volume, as well as an API key and a data directory. And also we need to enable CORS so that it allows our frontend to communicate with Typesense. The next step is to create Typesense client configuration, and we're going to start by creating an env file. So I'm going to type .env, and we are going to add the host, the port, the protocol, the API key, and the search API key as well. Now, to set up our Typesense configuration, we're going to create a new folder under the source directory, and we're going to name it lib. And we're going to create a new file that is going to be called typesense.ts. And the first thing that I want to do in this file is add the environment variables that are going to be mapped to some constants. And then I'm going to import the libraries that we installed, instant search adapter. And also we need to import the Typesense client. So the first thing we want to create with our configuration is to initialize the Typesense client. And we're going to add a nodes attribute that will contain our host, port, and protocol, as well as pass the API key and have some basic configuration attributes for the purpose of timeout, reliability, and retries. Alongside the Typesense client, we also need to create the adapter for instant search library. And this is how we can do it. It's quite similar to the client, but it's a bit different when it comes to implementation. So we still have our API key here and our nodes. Now, one thing that might be worth adding is the type for extended search parameters that includes Typesense. So we are going to create extended search parameters that will give TypeScript the ability to recognize the types and specific options. And finally, we just have to export the search client. Now we're going to create our schema definition for the recipes. I'm going to create a new file in the lib folder. I'm going to call it schema.ts. I'm going to import the dependencies, and I'm going to create a new interface that is called recipe, and it's going to contain the ID, the title, some ingredients, and other parameters. But just because we create an interface, that doesn't mean the schema is there. Therefore, we need to create a new constant called recipe schema that will be of the type collections create schema, and it will match the recipe interface that we created here. We're also going to need a function that will create those recipes in our database, and we're going to call that recipe schema, and we are going to do a couple of things. First of all, we're going to try and see if the recipe collection exists by using the Typesense client collections recipe retrieve function. And in case the collection does not exist, we are just going to go ahead and create that collection based on the recipe schema. And of course, we're going to need a function that will seed this data into the database. And to do that, I'm going to create a new function that is called seed recipe data. It's going to validate that the recipe is correct before sending it to the Typesense using a helper function. I'm going to create just in a moment right above here, which is going to check that whatever recipe we pass as an object is actually structured in the proper way. So inside the seed recipe data, we are going to check if there are any existing documents already in the collection. And if so, we can just say that's fine. Otherwise, what we are going to do is import those documents into the Typesense database. And for that, we are going to need two more interfaces to make sure that it is TypeScript compliant. And those two interfaces are the import response success and the import response error. So now if we scroll down to the seed recipe data function, we can now see that here we are going to import the documents and also request for a return ID to be sent to us when the import process has been completed. Now let's go ahead and create some dummy data. Let's go to the source folder and create a new folder that is called data, and create a new file that is called recipes.ts. And inside we are going to just add a dump of recipes. You can find the list of sample recipes by going to the GitHub repo. The link is in the description below. In order to seed the data, we need a link where we can press and seed this data into our database. And luckily, Nextjs comes with API routes. So let's go to the source folder and let's create a subfolder called API/init. And inside the init folder, I'm going to create a file that's going to be called root.ts. And inside the root file, I'm going to use this code right here. First of all, we are going to check if there is a Typesense connection, and then we are going to create a recipe schema, as well as seed the Typesense database with recipe data, and of course some debugging and output in the console to know what is going on. Now, this API route is going to be available at whatever your default Next.js configuration is. In our case, it's going to be localhost 3000/API/init. So if you click on this link, it will begin the process to upload the data into the database. Now, the final part of the code base is the UI. I would recommend you going to the GitHub repo to be able to check those components out and drag them into your own project. That being said, let's go ahead and create a new directory in the source folder, and I'm going to call that components. And inside the components, our very first component is going to be a header. So header.tsx. And in here, I'm going to add this very simple header, a title that's called Delicious Recipes, and just a link pointing to the home page. The next component that I'm going to create is a recipe card. So let's create recipecard.tsx, and this component is going to hold our recipe information in a nicely formatted UI. So what we are going to pass in as a prop is the actual recipe. Now, of course, another thing that we want to create for the UI is a search bar. And let's go ahead and create a component for the search bar, searchbar.tsx. And inside here, we are going to have a bit of logic. We are going to begin by the query state, which is going to hold just an empty state in the very beginning, so that all the items from my recipe list are going to be listed by default, because we don't have any particular query set. We also want to have a state that tracks whether we are searching or not. A debounce timer will allow us not to spam our database, so it gives a few milliseconds delay between each prompt. And we can see that particular debounce logic occurring right here. And of course, we need to have a handle submit button, which is going to be responsible for when we click on the enter or return key to perform a search. That is going to call the onSearch function that is passed as a prop. Overall, this is pretty much the whole logic for the search bar. And finally, we need one component for the filters. So let's create a filters.tsx file. And let's use this code right here. So just a couple of things. The filters is going to be a component on the left-hand side where you will be able to select the type of recipe as well as the cooking time. And this is why we have these props right here. So the selected tags as well as the available tags, the cooking time range. And we want to be able to adjust our filtering based on the parameters passed in here. And to make all this UI work nicely together, we need to update the layout.tsx file. Let's change the metadata to be our delicious recipes, and the page.tsx file, which is going to have some front-end logic for what we've built so far. And let's just briefly skim through it. We have a few states here that handle the recipes that are going to be filtered, as well as search query and the loading state, or the error state in case something goes wrong, to graciously handle the errors. We have a use effect that will call the API init to initialize Typesense with sample data and perform an initial search to fetch all the recipes. We, of course, have some fetch recipes that are going to be formatted with the correct type, which is recipe. And of course, all we need to do then is just have a handle search memorized so that we can prevent any sort of recreation on every render to avoid re-rendering issues. And of course, just some logic to handle search parameter changes and the search results that are going to be returned by the Typesense database. And all we need to do at the end is also be able to filter on the recipes by using some conditional logics, such as filtering by cooking time or filtering by tags. Cool. Now let's run Docker Compose app to get our local instance of Typesense up and running. Oh, and let's move the API folder inside the app. And once we've done that, let's go ahead and run npm run dev to start our Next.js instance. And we are also going to need to update our Next.js config here to allow for unsplashed images to be served on our app. So hit save and let's click on the localhost 3000. And now you can see that Delicious Recipes app is working just great. We can always search here for curry. And if we also make a mistake and just do curry, it's also going to work. So that is all you need to do to get yourself a Delicious Recipes app. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.